אף אתם צריכים להחזיק טובה לבניכם, שיקיימו את התורה אחריכם. אילו אין משה גדול הוא, ואילו אחר, וקיבלנו תורתו, לא הייתה תורתו שווה כלום. And a number of people suggest this should be a rhetorical question. Al achad kama, there's a scribal error here, v'kama, it's marked by scribal dots. So, al achad kama v'kama, v'kach ne'emar asher titzavum et b'nechem lishmor. Enjoin them upon your children to keep. Deuteronomy 32:46b. He, Moses, said to them, I should be grateful if you would maintain the Torah after me, that is, after my death. Similarly, you should be grateful to your children if they would maintain the Torah after you. It once happened that when our rabbi, Judah the Patriarch, came from Laodicea in Asia Minor, Rabbi Yossi, the son of Rabbi Yehuda bar Ilai, and Rabbi Elazar, the son of Yehuda, entered and sat before him. He said to them, as Yehuda Nasi, to the students, come close, come close. I should be grateful to you if you would maintain the Torah after me. Similarly, you should be grateful to your children if they would maintain the Torah after you. Had Moses not been great, or had he been someone else, and had we received his Torah, would it not have been worth a thing? How much more so? Therefore it says, enjoin them upon your children to keep. Before further unpacking this midrash, it should be noted that a different, shorter, more easily rendered strand of this midrashic tradition, especially the lines beginning with had Moses not been great, where there's a lot of textual scribal problems, appears to have been preserved in a Byzantine Yemenite tradition as evidenced in Midrash HaGadol and quite similarly in Midrash Lekach Tov, and here I'm citing from the former. It's also on your handout. O eino elo Moshe rabban shel nevi'im she'ilulei acharim shekayamu et torato ma hayta torato shaveh. Were it not for Moses, the greatest of prophets, and Lekach Tov has Gadol HaOlam, the greatest one and the greatest person alive. Okay, were it not for Moses, greatest of the prophets, and had not others maintained his Torah, what would his Torah have been worth? Again, a rhetorical question. In other words, without Moses' greatness and without the chain of tradition transmitting it through the generations, it's as if the Torah would not have been shaveh or shaveh klum. Note that instead of the word acher, singular, as in the manuscript London and its family of witnesses, which I have argued was awkward, we have here acherim, others, which could have been abbreviated as Aleph Chet Resh with an abbreviation sign, and subsequently miscopied as Acher, which makes less sense here than Acherim. Thus, hypothetically, a prior, or less corrupted text behind both versions could have been Ilu ein Moshe gadolu ve'ilulei acharim kiblu Torato. Had Moses not been so great, and or had others not received his Torah would not have been worth anything. Interestingly, no witnesses to this part of the Midrash includes both Acher and Acherim, suggesting that this is a differentiating marker between the two main recensions of the text, that is manuscript London and Company, which have Acher referring to a lawgiver other than Moses, and Midrash HaGadol, Midrash Lekach Tov, which has Acherim, referring to the successive generations of recipients after Moses. Note also that Midrash HaGadol and Midrash Lekach Tov recension lacks the concluding and awkward in manuscript London and its allied witnesses expression alachat kama v'kama, how much more so, as well as the concluding citation of the lemma, l'kach ne'emar, as it is said. It is possible that these are editorial accretions added for purposes of stylistic consistency. Although as collections, these midrashic anthologies are considerably later than the Sifrei, they may at times preserve texts and traditions that are earlier than the manuscript evidence for the Sifrei itself, and here I quote Menachem Kahana, it's a prolegomenon to the edition of the Sifrei B'Midbar. for this possibility. Two modern rabbinic scholars have significantly amended the text of the Sifrei here, using the first printed edition, virtually identical to the manuscript London, but pulling it into accord with the Midrash HaGadol, Midrash Lekach Tov tradition. Thus, the Gaon of Vilna, the Gra, 1720 to 1797, in his emendations, Hagahot, renders our difficult concluding lines as follows. Moshe Gadolu, ve'ilu lo ba'u acherim, lo hayta torato shaveh. Anu, halachat kama v'chama chole. Moses was great, but if others had not come to receive it, that is, his Torah, would not have been worth a thing. How much more is this the case for us? That is, we like Moses, or how much less than Moses, we have to rely on the transmission and not on the authorship. Similarly, Louis Finkelstein, in his edition, renders the end of our Midrash as follows. He may be based on the Gra, but he doesn't acknowledge it. Ilu ein Moshe Gadol ve'ilulei acharim kiblu Torah al yedo lo hayta shaveh. Anu al achad kama v'chama l'chak ne'emar asher kitzavum et b'neichem. I translate, with all of Moses' greatness, had no one received his Torah, it would not have been worth a thing. How much more is this the case for us? Therefore it says, enjoin them upon your children to keep. Notwithstanding these text-critical challenges at the end of the Midrashic passage, and my preference for the Midrash HaGadol / Midrash Lekach Tov recension, the various versions share some important exegetical features. In order to understand and appreciate them, it is first necessary to recognize an aspect of the biblical verse that might at first have gone unnoticed by the non-Midrashist. We might have expected Moses to enjoin his immediate audience, that is, the adults gathered to hear him before his death, to observe the commandments once they had crossed over the Jordan River and entered the land, but without any longer the advantage of his charismatic prophetic teaching and leadership. However, the biblical verse has Moses enjoined rather his audience to command their children to observe, as if looking to the grandchildren rather than to the immediate next generation. To command their children to observe all of the Torah's commandments, presumably in perpetuity, as would seem to be the implied meaning of verse 47. Through it you shall endure long in the land that you are to possess. The idea of longevity. Thus, according to Deuteronomy, in Moses' final days, his public role as commander and teacher-in-chief is not transmitted so much to future national leaders. For instance, Joshua, according to Numbers 27, 12 to 13, or Deuteronomy 31, 2 to 8, and 34, 8 to 9, or for instance to Ezra, according to Nehemiah 8, 1 to 8, but rather to the succession of parents and future parents, teachers and future teachers, in the private setting of the family or home or a place of study. And this, of course, is consistent with Deuteronomy's emphasis in general on intergenerational teaching. So, for instance, the Deuteronomy 6:10, V'shinam tam livanecha, but also many other examples that I listed in the notes. Turning to the Midrashic commentary to the second half of the verse, 3246b, it paraphrases Moses' speech to the people in a strikingly altered form and emotional tone. No longer is Moses the authority figure who commands absolute obedience to all the words of this teaching or Torah, but a suppliant who implores the people not only to maintain themselves the words of Torah after his impending death, but to beseech their children to do the same. Subtle as the change is, the verb lishmor, to observe, in the biblical text is replaced in Rabbinic Hebrew here by likayem, to maintain, which rabbinically denotes as well study and memorization. in the Midrash. Impotent, as it were, any longer to command, Moses must employ moral persuasion in the hope that the people will both maintain the words of Torah and perhaps even more importantly, transmit them to the next generation. And for it, implicitly at least, to do the same in turn in perpetuity. As if to signal from the advantage of hindsight that Moses and the successive generations of Israelites succeeded in so fulfilling and transmitting the Torah laws, we are suddenly transported forward in time approximately 1400 years to the study, as it were, of Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, Judah the Patriarch, who, as purported editor of the Mishnah, the earliest and most consequential digest of rabbinic Torah law, might be and is thought of as a latter-day Moses. Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, we may infer, is either toward the end of his life or anticipating it, because he also says Acharai. He, we are told, has just returned from a mission of some sort to Laodicea, probably the one on the Lycus River, a heavenly Hellenized Roman provincial city in Asia Minor, modern-day Turkey. And we know from recent archaeology that it was a thriving Hellenistic and Christian location. But it had a substantial Jewish as well as Christian population. Okay, from the story, we do not know what Rabbi Judah the Patriarch experienced there, but it would seem to have caused him to worry about the present and or future state of Judaism in a highly Hellenized environment. Inviting two students to come close, doubly expressed in some witnesses such as manuscript London, Kivu Lakan, thereby indicating perhaps intimacy, but also urgency. He says to them in the words of the Midrash exactly what Moses said to the people at the end of his life some 1400 years earlier. In this context, children could mean biological offspring or students, intellectual offspring, or both. And I give some Midrashic examples of the Banim being Talmidim. The pathos here is similar to that of Moses in his waning days. With all the learning and authority that Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi commands, he cannot command or coerce his students, but only implore them, lachazik tova, but only implore them to fulfill and transmit what he has imparted to them, to their children or students. And so on, Rabbi Judah the Patriarch is clearly portrayed here as a latter-day Moses, perhaps also implying a parallel in status between their respective Torahs, written and oral, and the fragile nature of both. The absolute identity of the Midrashic words of Moses to those of Rabbi Judah the Patriarch, and the similarity and shared pathos of their situations might lead us to overlook some fundamental differences between them. Moses, after all, is publicly addressing the whole Israelite people, while Rabbi Judah the Patriarch is privately and intimately addressing two of his students. There being two, of course, allows Rabbi Judah the Patriarch to employ the same second-person plural forms of address as is attributed to Moses. There is a shift from a great leader publicly enjoining the corporate Israel to a later great teacher who does so privately to two individuals and by way of them to their children or students. Thus, Moses' message and role as midrashically construed has become more individualized and intimatized with time, as presumably it has become for the we of the Midrash's audience. That is, rabbinic study in this period is small circles of teachers and students, and not on the model of Moses' national prophetic figures. They are free now as autonomous individuals to be moved or not to compliance. They are to be moved or not to compliance by the rhetoric of mitzvah as legacy, but also of free choice. Both Moses, as midrashically reinvented, and Rabbi Judah the Patriarch seek not just immediate observance of the commandments, but long-term maintenance of words of Torah now entrusted to internalized textual study among small groups of masters and disciples rather than to mass acceptance of the laws by the people as a whole. Na'aseh v'nishma, for example. Note as well the subtle role reversal of masters and students, or we might say patron and clients. While they come presumably with the intent of paying their respects to Rabbi Judah the Patriarch, note the hierarchical language of, quote, they entered and sat before him, it is he who is now revealed to be dependent on their favor. The honor that they expect to bestow upon him is now reversed, being no longer an expression of his superior status, but of his total dependence upon them to carry forward his teaching. And I have a footnote here on patronage in rabbinic society. Getting near the end. The full pathos of Moses' words, and by extension those of Rabbi Judah the Patriarch, is indicated in the concluding sentence of the Midrashic commentary, regardless of which textual strand one prefers to follow. In either case, the critical role of transmission across the generations, whether by children or by students, is emphasized, while the commanding role of Moses, and by extension Judah the Patriarch, is sidelined. Moses' prophetic greatness does not ensure the maintenance of Torah teaching, but rather is contingent upon it. That is, upon the reception, fulfillment, and transmission of his words, understood to encompass the totality of rabbinic divrei Torah, by successive generations. Not of prophetic leaders, as in the chain of transmission in the opening lines of Pirkei Avot, but of teachers and parents able to impress the laws and teachings of his Torah upon their students and children to both observe and transmit. Likewise, we are told, it is as if Moses' Torah, and we may infer Moses himself, and by extension Rabbi Judah the Patriarch, would not have been of any worth or consequence had the chain of transmission not been continued. The Midrash, at least as explicitly amended by the Gra and Finkelstein, and less boldly asserted by Manuscript London's introduction of we, makes one final gigantic temporal leap, as it were, this time to the present of the text's auditors, with another argument of Kal v'chomer, although not fully tagged as such and absent in the Midrash HaGadol, Midrash Lekach Tov recension. Just as Moses's, that is his Torah's worth, with all of his greatness, was entirely contingent on his ability to impress the responsibility of transmission on the minds and hearts of his successors, how much more is that the case for us, Anu, who shrink before the greatness of Moses and by association before that of Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi. Or as Manuscript London expresses it, the maintenance and transmission of the Torah is contingent on us rather than on Moses' prophetic greatness and revelatory authorship. Even had he not been so great, or not been the Torah's commandment to begin with, if it was somebody else, Acher, we would still have been expected to receive, maintain, and transmit it in perpetuity. How much more so with Moses and his greatness. Nevertheless, the Torah could have been maintained or not by us without him. Ironically, we, in effect, are now the equals, at least, of Moses and Rabbi Judah the Patriarch in bearing the weight of the continuity of the chain of transmission. They are dependent on us, as it were, to maintain their words of Torah, as we are dependent upon them for the words of Torah's prophetic and canonical authority. Although not explicitly stated here by the Sifrei, our inclusion as the latest link is midrashically affected by the biblical verses present reference in 46a to this day, as if signaling the longue durée of the perpetual presence in which every successive day is signified as Hayom Hazeh. And I give quite a few examples elsewhere in the Sifrei where the use of Hayom Hazeh, which appears I think 42 times in Deuteronomy, is understood to mean this day, today, the day that we're reading or studying the text. Conclusion. In conclusion, let me first address the question of whether the two halves of our Midrash can constitute a whole greater than the sum of its parts, even as each one can stand perfectly well on its own. Both halves are honest yet radical in emphasizing the precariously fragile, unstable nature of words of, that is, rabbinic oral Torah, especially as transmitted orally through study and memorization. The first does so by comparing divrei Torah to mountains suspended by a hair, referring either to their tenuous scriptural warrants, as in the parallel in Chagiga 1:8, or to the tenuous task of their retention and transmission through memorization, at any moment liable to being severed from their roots or hairline suspension. The second half of the Midrash does so by emphasizing the intergenerational human challenge to observing and transmitting words of Torah. So therefore the emphasis is not on the inherent fragileness of words of Torah, but to the inherent challenges of human transmission, that is the actors. The challenge to observing and transmitting words of Torah from teacher to student and parent to child without the ability, already with Moses, of being able to command absolute fidelity. Not only do the two halves of the Midrash share with each other the rhetorical argument of Kal v'chomer, but not as explicitly in the second half, but they both do so with irony, reversing the seemingly obvious designation of heavy and light, or light and heavy. The temple is no more sturdy than the fragile words of Torah, and Moses, and Rabbi Judah the Patriarch by association, is no greater than his successors when it comes to obligating the next generation to observe the commandments. Our, as it were, words of Torah are as fragile as were theirs, and we, as it were, are as impotent as were they to command obedience from our children and or students. In the end, all we, as it were, can do is implore them, as were we, to carry forward the charge based on a rhetoric no longer of Sinai-based commandment, but of cross-generational fidelity to legacy. Thus, in addition to, or between, covers rhetorical mythic vectors of law as social contract, rights, and law as Sinaitic revelation, commandments, we might interpose that of law as legacy, which draws upon both, without necessarily negating or superseding either. From the myth of Sinai for its diachronic, intergenerational transmission of commandments, even without an immediate commander-in-chief or lieutenant commander, while upon the myth of social contract for its synchronic creation of sympathetic communities in which transmission can take place. Both can instill and inspire what Cover calls bonds of solidarity, whether vertically or horizontally. But so too can law, as historically transcendent legacy, extending back to Sinai in shared memory and forward through the present of shared community to the next generation, at least, in unassured anticipation and aspiration. Stated differently, Moses retains, at least for now, his greatness, but remains precariously dependent upon our, as it were, bonds of both collective and individual solidarity with both one another and with his legacy. Circling back to Cover, we can say that a central mythic component of the Jewish legal legacy is the very self-understanding of being commanded. Thank you.